The alarm on my wrist buzzed hard enough to make my coffee spill across the table. Station Kessler Ring did not sound alarms for nothing. I was on my feet before the second buzz finished, my body remembering things my mind had tried to forget for 6 years. Old training does not fade. It waits. I am Daniel Hargrove, former sergeant of the 3rd Expeditionary Corps, now a maintenance technician on a station that used to be my battlefield and is now, somehow, my home. The war between humanity and the Threll Empire ended 6 years ago. Peace came slow and messy, the way peace always does. Kessler Ring became one of the first shared stations where humans and a dozen alien species tried to live side by side. Most days it worked. Some days it barely did. The alarm turned out to be nothing dangerous, just a pressure valve malfunction in Deck 9, the kind of thing that happens twice a month and scares everyone half to death anyway. By the time I fixed it, my shift was almost over and my stomach was growling loud enough to embarrass me. I headed to the central cafeteria, the one place on this station where every species eats together, or at least sits in the same room pretending the tension between our governments does not exist. The room was loud with a dozen languages, the smell of foods from 6 different worlds mixing in a way that should not have worked but somehow did. I grabbed my tray and looked for a seat. That was when I saw her. A small alien girl sat alone at the end of a long table near the window, the kind of window that looks out on nothing but stars and silence. She belonged to the Varel, a species that came to Kessler Ring as refugees after their home system was caught in the crossfire of the war. Nobody talks about the Varel much. They arrived with nothing, and on a station run mostly by human and Threll bureaucracy, nothing does not go very far. The girl could not have been more than 8 years old, if Varel years translate close to ours. She had pale blue skin, large amber eyes, and thin limbs that seemed built for a lighter gravity than the one Kessler Ring provided. She sat with perfect posture, the kind of stillness that children usually do not have unless someone taught it to them the hard way. In front of her sat a small metal lunchbox, dented at one corner, the paint mostly worn away. She opened it slowly, glanced around the room once, quick and careful, then reached inside and brought her hand to her mouth. She chewed on nothing. She swallowed nothing. She did this 3 times before closing the lunchbox again and folding her hands in her lap like she had just finished a real meal. I stood there holding my tray, feeling something twist hard in my chest. I have seen a lot of things in this uniform, back when I still wore one. I have seen soldiers bleed out in mud that was not even their color. I have seen entire settlements go dark on my scanner in the space of a single night. I thought I had built enough scar tissue that nothing new could reach me anymore. I was wrong. Something about the careful, practiced way she pretended to eat told me this was not the first time. This was a routine, a performance she had rehearsed so the other children around her, laughing and trading real food, would not notice the empty box in her hands. I did not walk over. Not yet. Something in my gut, the same instinct that once told me not to trust a quiet tree line, told me that walking over right then would only embarrass her in front of everyone. Children have pride too. Sometimes more than adults, because they have less to protect it with. So I sat 2 tables away, close enough to watch, far enough to not be noticed. I ate my food slowly, my appetite mostly gone, and I kept my eyes on her without making it obvious. She sat there for another 10 minutes after her fake meal, watching the other kids the way a soldier watches an enemy position, careful, calculating, learning their patterns without ever stepping into their view. Then she stood, tucked the lunchbox under her arm, and walked out of the cafeteria alone. I almost got up to follow her, my legs actually tensed for it, but a voice in my head, sharper and older than my own, told me to wait. Watching is not the same as helping, but sometimes it is the only responsible first step, especially when you do not yet understand the shape of the problem you are looking at. I finished my meal without tasting a bite of it. That night, back in my quarters, I could not stop thinking about her. I have a daughter back on Earth, grown now, living her own life on a continent I have not visited in years. Watching that Varel girl pretend to eat brought back a memory I had buried on purpose, a memory of my own daughter at that age, laughing over a lunch I had packed for her before I shipped out for the last time. The contrast between that memory and what I had just watched made my chest ache in a way no old wound ever had. I told myself it was not my business. Station Kessler Ring had aid programs, refugee services, a whole department meant to handle exactly this kind of situation. I was a maintenance technician, not a social worker, not a soldier anymore, not anybody with the authority to fix a broken system built by people far above my pay grade. I told myself that, and I did not believe a word of it. I pulled up the station directory on my tablet and searched for Varel refugee family records. The system denied me access almost instantly, flagging my clearance level as insufficient. Of course it did. 6 years out of uniform meant 6 years of watching my old authority erode into nothing but a pension and a set of skills nobody on a peace station needed very often. I set the tablet down and stared at the ceiling of my quarters for a long time. I kept seeing her face. Not scared, not desperate, just quiet. Quiet in a way that made it worse. A child who has learned to hide her hunger has learned something no child should ever need to learn. The next morning, I changed my shift schedule so my lunch break would line up with hers. I told myself it was curiosity. I told myself a lot of things over the next few days that were not entirely true. When I walked into the cafeteria the second day, she was already there, same seat, same window, same small dented lunchbox in front of her. I watched her repeat the exact same routine: open the box, glance around, pretend to eat 3 times, close the box, sit still until the room started thinning out, then leave alone. 3 days of watching taught me things a lifetime of combat had never fully prepared me for. I learned that pain does not always look like blood and screaming. Sometimes it looks like a child sitting perfectly still, doing everything right, hiding everything wrong. On the 4th day, something changed. A group of older children, human and Threll mixed, walked past her table laughing about something on one of their tablets. One of them, a human boy maybe 11 years old, nudged his friend and pointed at her lunchbox with a smirk that made my hands curl into fists under the table before I even realized I had moved. "Why do you always eat so slow?" the boy said. Not unkindly exactly. More curious, in the careless way children are curious, without understanding the weight of their own words. Is Varel food supposed to be invisible or something? The girl did not answer. She closed the lunchbox fast, too fast, and one of her hands trembled just slightly before she steadied it. The boy shrugged, lost interest, and walked off with his friends, already forgetting the moment entirely. She sat there a long time after that, staring at the closed lunchbox like it had betrayed her. I stood up before I had fully decided to. My tray clattered slightly as I set it down. I did not walk toward her, not yet. I was not ready, and more importantly, I did not think she was ready for a stranger, especially a human in a station uniform, to suddenly take an interest in her private pain. Instead, I walked to the counter, bought a second meal with my own credits, wrapped it properly, and left it on an empty table near the exit she always used to leave. Then I walked away without looking back, my heart pounding harder than it had during actual combat operations, which felt strange and almost embarrassing to admit even to myself. I did not see what happened next. I told myself that was fine. That was enough for one day. But when I came back the following afternoon and glanced at that same exit table out of habit, I saw something that stopped me cold. The wrapped meal I had left was gone, the wrapping folded neatly and placed in the recycling slot exactly the way station etiquette required. Someone had eaten it. Someone had eaten it and cleaned up after themselves with careful, deliberate respect. I did not know for certain it was her. But some part of me, the same part that had learned to trust instinct over evidence in 100 dangerous situations, was already certain. I sat down at my usual table, 2 seats away from hers, and for the first time in 6 years since I left the service, I felt something close to purpose again. Not the kind that comes with orders and objectives and a chain of command telling you what matters. The quieter kind. The kind that comes from deciding, on your own, that something matters, and that you are not going to look away from it no matter how small or inconvenient it seems to everyone else. I did not know yet what I was going to do. I only knew I could not keep sitting 2 tables away, watching, and calling it enough. That night, I opened an old file on my tablet, one I had not touched in years. A contact list from my service days, names and comm codes of people who once trusted me with their lives, and I once trusted with mine. Some of them had gone quiet after the war. Some of them had risen into positions of real authority, the kind that could open doors a retired sergeant could not open alone. I stared at the list for a long time, before I finally sent the first message. I did not know it yet, but that single message was the first step toward uncovering something far bigger than one girl's empty lunchbox. It was the beginning of a fight I thought I had left behind forever, one that would test everything I believed about duty, about promises, and about what it truly means to protect someone, even after the uniform comes off and the war is supposed to be over. The reply came back faster than I expected. Owen Baxter, a man I once pulled out of a collapsed bunker with my own hands, was now a logistics officer, stationed 2 decks below me on Kessler Ring. I had not spoken to him in almost 2 years, not since a brief message exchange after his youngest son was born. His response was short. He asked why a retired sergeant suddenly wanted access to Varel refugee records after 6 years of silence. I told him the truth. A child was starving quietly in front of everyone, and nobody seemed to be looking. He agreed to meet me the next morning before my shift. We met in a small maintenance lounge on Deck 7, a place quiet enough that nobody would overhear us. Owen looked older than I remembered, gray creeping into his hair, tired lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with years of paperwork instead of purpose. He listened to my description of the girl without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly when I described the empty lunchbox routine. Varel refugee families fall under a labor contract system, he said finally, keeping his voice low even though we were alone. It was supposed to be temporary, a way to help them earn housing credits while they rebuild after losing their home system. In practice, it has become something closer to debt servitude. The contracts renew automatically if the debt is not paid in full, and the interest rates are set high enough that most families never get close to paying it off. How high is high? I asked. High enough that a family working full shifts can spend a decade paying off what should have taken a single year, he said. The system was written by corporate contractors, not by station command. Command mostly looks the other way because the labor keeps essential systems running cheap. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This was not a broken system by accident. This was a system built to stay broken on purpose, because someone somewhere profited from it staying that way. Can you pull the family record? I asked. Just enough to know her name and her situation. I am not asking you to break protocol. I am asking you to help me understand what I am looking at, before I decide what to do about it. Owen hesitated, glancing at the door like old habits from wartime intelligence work still lived in him too. Then he nodded slowly and pulled out his tablet. It took him almost 10 minutes to find her. When he finally turned the screen toward me, I saw a small photograph attached to a family file. The same amber eyes, the same careful, quiet expression. Her name was Vesa. Her family designation listed her parents as Torin and Amira, both employed under Kessler Ring's labor debt program in the lower deck recycling facilities, one of the most physically demanding and lowest paid sectors on the entire station. Their listed debt balance made my stomach turn. It was a number that would take most families years to pay off even under generous terms, and these terms were anything but generous. They arrived 4 years ago, Owen said quietly. Their home settlement was destroyed during a border skirmish near the end of the war, not by Threll forces. By ours. That last sentence hit me harder than anything else he had said. I sat back slowly, the weight of it pressing down on my chest. Human forces, I said, not really a question. A supply convoy diverted through Varel territory during a retreat, Owen said. There was an engagement. The official report calls it unavoidable collateral contact. The unofficial version, the one that never made it into any public record, is that a convoy commander made a bad call under pressure, and an entire settlement paid the price for it. I closed my eyes for a moment. I remembered convoys like that. I remembered retreats that turned into chaos. Decisions made in seconds that echoed for years afterward, in ways the people making them rarely had to witness firsthand. I had made calls like that myself, more than once, and I had spent 6 years trying not to think too hard about who paid the price for my mistakes. So her family lost everything because of us, I said, and now they are trapped in a debt system that will never let them recover, also because of us. Owen did not answer right away. He did not need to. The silence said enough. I thanked him, told him I would keep his name out of anything that happened next, and left the lounge with more questions than answers but a much clearer picture of what I was actually looking at. This was not a simple story about one hungry child. This was a story about a debt that humanity owed, and had been quietly, systematically avoiding paying for years. Over the next several days, I kept watching Vesa in the cafeteria, but now I watched with new eyes. I noticed things I had missed before. The careful way she avoided eye contact with any adult wearing a station labor badge, as if she had learned that badges meant trouble for her family. The way she flinched, just slightly, whenever an announcement played over the cafeteria speakers, as if every automated voice carried the possibility of bad news. The way she always left, exactly when the room started thinning out. Never a moment before or after, like she had timed her exit to avoid drawing attention in either direction. I also noticed something else. She was smart. Sharper than most children her age. Twice I watched her solve a station navigation puzzle on an idle public terminal, faster than the human children standing beside her, only to quietly step back and let one of them claim the win when an adult walked by to praise the group. She was hiding more than just her hunger. She was hiding her own light, because somewhere along the way, she had learned that being noticed, in any way, carried risk for a virile refugee child on this station. That realization made something in me settle into place, hard and certain, the way decisions used to settle in the middle of a mission, when the plan finally clicked. I could not fix the entire labor debt system by myself. I was not naive enough to think one retired sergeant could undo years of corporate policy and bureaucratic neglect overnight. But I could do something. I could start somewhere small and real, and let that small start grow into whatever it needed to become. The next day, I brought 2 meals to the cafeteria instead of 1. I sat 2 tables away as usual, ate my own food slowly, and left the second meal in the same spot near the exit, wrapped properly. No note, no explanation. I did not want to frighten her with direct contact yet. I wanted her to know, in whatever quiet way she could understand it, that someone had noticed and someone cared, without the pressure of a stranger suddenly demanding her attention. This continued for 8 days. Every day the wrapped meal disappeared. Every day the wrapping came back neatly folded in the recycling slot. A small silent thank you, from someone who clearly did not trust the world enough yet to say it out loud. On the 9th day, everything changed. I arrived at the cafeteria, a little later than usual, delayed by an unexpected repair job on Deck 4. By the time I got there, the room was almost empty, most of the lunch crowd already gone. I spotted Vesa immediately, sitting alone at her usual table, but something was wrong. Her shoulders were shaking slightly, and her small hands were pressed tight against her lunchbox like she was trying to hold something together, or hold herself together. Standing near her table were 2 station security officers, human, both wearing the stern expressions of people executing an unpleasant duty they did not particularly enjoy, but had no authority to refuse. One of them held a tablet displaying what looked like a labor violation notice. I moved closer, close enough to hear, without immediately inserting myself into the situation. "Your parents missed their shift quota again this cycle," the taller officer was saying, his voice not cruel exactly, but flat and procedural, in a way that felt almost worse than cruelty. "That means additional interest applies to the outstanding balance. We are required to notify listed dependents when a family unit falls below minimum compliance." Vesa said nothing. She simply nodded, the way a soldier nods when receiving orders they know they cannot refuse, and I felt something inside me crack wide open. I stepped forward before I had fully decided to. "Is there a problem here?" I asked, keeping my voice level, calm, the voice I used to use when de-escalating tense situations between allied units who did not trust each other yet. Both officers turned toward me, clearly surprised that anyone had intervened. The taller one straightened slightly, recognizing my maintenance uniform, but also, I suspected, recognizing something in my posture that years of civilian life had never fully erased. "This is a labor compliance matter," he said, "not a maintenance issue." "She is 8 years old," I said. "You are notifying an 8-year-old about her parents' debt balance in the middle of a public cafeteria. Is that standard procedure, or did someone decide this was an acceptable way to spend their afternoon?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Protocol requires dependent notification within 24 hours of a compliance shortfall. We do not make the protocol, we just follow it." "Then maybe the protocol needs someone to ask why it exists in the first place," I said. The 2 officers exchanged a glance, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to argue further with someone whose service record, if they bothered to check it, would outrank their current authority by a significant margin. The taller one finally nodded once, closed his tablet, and the pair walked away without another word. I turned to Vesa. She was staring up at me with wide amber eyes, somewhere between fear and something else I could not quite name yet. Cautious hope, maybe. Or simple shock that an adult had actually stepped between her and something frightening, instead of walking past it. "Are you all right?" I asked gently, crouching down slightly so I was not looming over her the way adults sometimes do without realizing how intimidating it feels to a child. She did not answer right away. She just looked at me, then down at her lunchbox, then back up at me again, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she had never encountered before. An adult who noticed. An adult who stayed. "You gave me the food," she said finally, her voice small but steady. "Every day. It was you." It was not a question. I nodded slowly, surprised she had figured it out, though I suppose I should not have been. She was smarter than most people gave her credit for. She had been watching me the same way I had been watching her. "Yes," I said. "It was me." Her eyes filled with something that made my chest ache all over again. A mixture of gratitude and disbelief, so raw it did not belong on a child's face. "Why?" she asked simply. I thought about how to answer that honestly, without overwhelming her with everything I had learned over the past week, without making promises I was not yet sure I could keep. "Because nobody should have to pretend to eat," I said. "And because someone should have noticed sooner." She looked down at her lunchbox again, her small fingers tracing the dented corner like it held answers I could not yet see. Then, slowly, carefully, as if deciding whether to trust me with something fragile, she opened it and turned it toward me. Inside, taped to the underside of the lid, was a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges, from what must have been countless openings and closings. She hesitated for a moment, then peeled it free, and held it out toward me with both hands, the way someone offers something they have protected for a very long time. "You should see this," she said quietly. "I think you are supposed to see this." I took the paper carefully, my hands feeling strangely unsteady for someone who had once diffused explosives under enemy fire without a tremor. I unfolded it slowly, and what I saw inside stopped my breath entirely. It was a drawing, made in the careful, slightly uneven strokes of a child working with whatever colors she could find. It showed a group of small figures standing together, blue-skinned like her, holding hands in front of a building, with a broken roof drawn in jagged lines to show damage. Beside them stood one much larger figure, drawn in gray and silver, clearly meant to represent a human soldier in full armor plating. Above the armored figure, written in careful, uneven galactic standard lettering, was a single word: Protector. Beneath the drawing, in smaller writing that looked like it had been added later, in a different colored pencil, were a few more words. They did not come easy for me to read, though the lettering itself was simple enough. My throat tightened before I even finished the sentence. "He said we would be safe. He said humans do not leave people behind." I stared at that drawing for a long time, longer than I meant to, my mind racing backward through years of memory I had tried very hard to leave sealed away. A settlement with a broken roof, a rescue, a human soldier who made a promise to a group of frightened viral survivors in the middle of a war zone. "Vesa," I said slowly, my voice rougher than I intended. "Can you tell me about this? About the soldier in the drawing?" She nodded, her small hands folding together in her lap, the way they did whenever she prepared to say something important. "My mother told me the story," she said. "Before the bad thing happened to our old home, there was a fight. Soldiers came, and some of them helped us get out before the building fell down. One soldier especially. He carried my brother on his back, because my brother could not walk fast enough. He told my mother that humans protect people who cannot protect themselves. He said it very clearly, so she would remember it exactly." "Do you know his name?" I asked, my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with any physical danger. She shook her head slowly. "My mother never learned it. There was too much noise, and everyone was moving too fast. But she remembered his voice. She said he sounded calm, even when everything around him was falling apart. She said that calm voice was the only reason she believed they would survive that night." I sat back slightly, the drawing still trembling faintly in my hands. I did not know for certain, could not know for certain, whether the soldier in that memory was someone from my own unit, or even someone I had personally commanded during that final chaotic stretch of the war. There were dozens of rescue operations during those last months, hundreds of soldiers moving through collapsing settlements trying to pull survivors free before retreat orders forced everyone back. It could have been anyone, but it could also have been someone I knew. Someone under my command, someone who made a promise on my behalf, whether he realized it or not, a promise that an 8-year-old girl had carried inside her lunchbox for years, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft as fabric. And here I was, 6 years later, watching that same girl pretend to eat from an empty box, while the very system meant to help her family, instead buried them deeper in debt every single cycle. Whether or not it was my soldier who made that promise did not matter anymore. It was humanity's promise, and humanity, in the form of contracts and interest rates and quiet bureaucratic neglect, had broken it. "Vesa," I said, folding the drawing carefully and handing it back to her with both hands, the same careful respect she had shown when she gave it to me. "I am going to ask you something, and I need you to trust me, even though I know trust is not easy for you right now." She looked up at me, waiting. "I want to meet your parents," I said, "not to cause trouble for them. I want to understand exactly what is happening with your family's contract, and I want to see if there is anything that can be done to help. I cannot promise you everything will change overnight, but I can promise you I am not going to walk away now that I know." She studied my face for a long moment, the same careful, evaluating look I imagined she used on everyone who claimed to want to help her family. Children who have been let down before learn to read adults the way soldiers learn to read terrain, searching for the places where the ground might give way beneath them. Finally she nodded. "They finished their shift in 3 hours," she said. "They live in Sector 12, Lower Deck 3. It is not a nice place. I do not think you will like it there." "I have lived in worse places," I said gently. "Trust me." She almost smiled at that, the first real expression I had seen cross her face since I met her, small and fleeting but genuine. It was enough to make the ache in my chest feel a little lighter. 3 hours later, I made my way down to Lower Deck 3, a part of Kessler Ring most of the station's better-off residents never bothered visiting. The corridors here were narrower, the lighting dimmer, the air carrying a faint metallic tang from recycling systems that never quite got properly maintained because maintenance budgets for this sector always seemed to fall last on every priority list. Vesa met me at the entrance to Sector 12, having apparently finished whatever she needed to do after school hours, and led me through a maze of narrow corridors, lined with small residential units, each barely large enough for a single family to fit comfortably. The atmosphere here felt heavier somehow, not just from the air recyclers, but from something less tangible, a weight of exhaustion that seemed to press down on everyone we passed. We arrived at a unit marked with a simple number plate, and Vesa knocked twice before letting herself in with a small keycard. Inside, the space was cramped but clean, every surface carefully organized despite the limited room. A Varel woman sat at a small table, her posture tired but alert, rising immediately when she saw me standing in the doorway behind her daughter. "Vesa," she said sharply, her voice carrying both concern and warning. "Who is this?" "Mother, this is Daniel," Vesa said quickly, stepping between us in a way that struck me as protective, though I was not entirely sure which of us she was protecting. "He has been giving me food at the cafeteria. He wants to help us." The woman, who I now knew was Amira, studied me with the same careful, evaluating expression her daughter had used earlier, though hers carried years more weariness behind it. "Humans who want to help usually want something in return," she said, not unkindly, just honestly. The way someone speaks when experience has taught them caution is survival. "I do not want anything from you," I said. "I served in the war. I was there during the final years, in operations near Varel territory. I do not know if I ever crossed paths with your family directly, but I know what happened to your settlement, and I know the debt system your family is trapped in was built on top of that tragedy. I think that is wrong, and I think something should be done about it." Amira's expression shifted slightly, surprise mixing with something guarded and uncertain. She glanced at her daughter, then back at me, before finally gesturing toward the small table. "Sit," she said. "If you truly want to understand, you should hear the whole story, not just the parts my daughter has pieced together from a drawing she refuses to stop carrying." I sat down carefully, the chair creaking slightly under my weight, and Amira began to speak. She told me about the night their settlement came under fire. Not from any Threll assault as most official records claimed, but from a human supply convoy that mistook their outpost for an enemy staging area during a chaotic retreat. She told me about the confusion, the fires, the sound of structural supports failing overhead. She told me about a small unit of human soldiers who arrived not to attack, but to pull survivors free from the wreckage once the mistake became clear, working through the night despite orders to fall back with the retreating convoy. She told me about one soldier in particular, the one who carried her son on his back through half-collapsed corridors, the one who made sure every family in that shelter made it out before he would allow himself to leave. She described his voice exactly the way Vesa had, calm, in a way that felt almost unnatural given the chaos surrounding him. "He told us we would not be forgotten," Amira said quietly. "He told us humanity does not abandon the people it has wronged." I believed him. For a long time. I am not sure I believe him anymore. Her words landed heavier than any blow I had taken in 6 years of combat. I sat there, absorbing the full weight of what she was telling me, and something inside me hardened into resolve. "I cannot undo what happened that night," I said finally. "I was not there, and even if I had been, nothing I say now can change what your family lost. But I can look at what is happening now, at this debt contract that is keeping your family trapped years after that promise was made, and I can try to make sure it gets fixed. I have contacts still active in Station Command. I have a service record that carries some weight, even 6 years removed from the uniform. I am not asking you to trust that things will change overnight. I am asking you to give me the chance to try." Amira studied me for a long, silent moment. Then she reached into a small storage compartment beside the table and pulled out a data chip, worn and scratched from years of handling. "This contains everything," she said, sliding it across the table toward me. "Every payment record, every interest adjustment, every notice we have received since we arrived on this station. I have kept it all, hoping someday, someone in a position to help would actually look at it honestly. Perhaps that day has finally come." I picked up the chip carefully, feeling its small weight settle into my palm like something far heavier than its physical size suggested. "I will look at every page of this," I said, "and I will not stop until someone in authority answers for what this system has done to your family, and to every other family trapped in the same trap." Vesa, who had been standing quietly near the doorway during the entire conversation, stepped forward and took my hand gently, her small fingers surprisingly firm around mine. "You promise," she said, not quite a question, more a request for confirmation, the way children ask when they desperately want to believe something, but have learned the world does not always keep its word. I crouched down to meet her eyes directly, the same way I once knelt beside wounded soldiers to make sure they understood every word I said mattered. "I promise," I said, "and I keep my promises." She studied my face for a long moment, searching for any sign of hesitation, any crack in my resolve. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she finally allowed herself a small, tentative smile, the second one I had earned from her, and this one lasted a little longer than the first. I left Sector 12 that evening with the data chip secured carefully in my jacket pocket, my mind already racing through every contact I had left from my service days, every favor I was owed, every door I might need to force open to make good on the promise I had just made to an 8-year-old girl and her exhausted mother. I did not sleep much that night. I stayed up reviewing the contents of that data chip line by line, my anger growing steadily with every payment record, every arbitrary interest hike, every notice that seemed designed less to collect a legitimate debt, and more to ensure the debt could never actually be paid off. The system was not broken by accident. Someone had built it this way on purpose, and someone was profiting from every family trapped inside it. By the time the station's artificial dawn cycle began, I had a plan forming, rough and incomplete, but a plan nonetheless. I was going to need help. I was going to need people with authority I no longer possessed, people willing to risk their own standing to challenge a system that clearly benefited powerful interests on this station. I thought about Owen, about the discomfort in his eyes when he first told me about the labor contracts. I thought about the 2 security officers who had backed down the moment someone with a military bearing questioned their protocol out loud. I thought about every soldier I had ever served with who joined the military because they genuinely believed in protecting people who could not protect themselves. Somewhere on this station, there had to be more people like that. People who had simply forgotten, in the slow, grinding routine of peacetime bureaucracy, what that belief was supposed to feel like. I was going to remind them. The next morning, I requested a formal meeting with the station's labor oversight office, using my veteran status to secure an appointment faster than a civilian request would normally allow. The office itself was small and cramped, tucked into an administrative corridor on Deck 5, staffed by a handful of overworked clerks, who looked like they had long ago stopped expecting anyone to challenge the paperwork they processed every day. The officer who met with me, a man named Ethan Cole, listened to my initial explanation with a polite but distant expression, the kind bureaucrats wear when they have heard 100 complaints before and expect this one to end the same way all the others did. "I understand your concern," he said, folding his hands on the desk between us, "but the labor debt program was established through a legitimate contract system, approved by Station Command 5 years ago. Families sign these agreements voluntarily upon arrival." "Voluntarily," I repeated. "A family arrives as a refugee with nothing, no housing, no resources, no alternative options, and you call it voluntary. When they sign a contract, that is the only thing standing between them and living in a corridor. That is not consent. That is desperation being exploited." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not back down. "I sympathize with your perspective, Sergeant Hargrove, but I do not have the authority to void or amend existing contracts. That decision falls under corporate labor oversight, not station administration." "Then give me the name of someone who does have that authority," I said. He hesitated, glancing toward a closed door at the back of the office before answering. "Director Priya Kapoor oversees corporate labor agreements for this sector. But I should warn you, she does not typically meet with individual complainants. These matters are usually handled through formal legal channels, which can take months, sometimes years, to resolve." "I do not have months," I said. "There is a child on this station pretending to eat from an empty lunchbox every single day because her family cannot get ahead of a debt that was designed to never be paid off. I am not filing a formal complaint through channels that will bury this in paperwork until everyone involved has moved on or given up. I am asking to speak to the person responsible, directly, today." Ethan studied me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, a flicker of the same discomfort I had seen in Owen days earlier. Whatever he saw in my expression seemed to convince him that arguing further would not end the conversation any faster. "Wait here," he said finally, standing and disappearing through the back door. He returned 15 minutes later, looking slightly less composed than when he left. "Director Kapoor will see you," he said. "But I should tell you, she does not appreciate having her time wasted." "Neither do I said, and followed him through the door. Director Priya Kapoor's office was considerably larger than the outer waiting area, decorated with framed commendations, and a wide viewport, overlooking the station's central docking ring. She sat behind a polished desk, sharp-eyed and clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, studying me with the practiced neutrality of someone who had built a career out of not showing her hand. "Sergeant Hargrove," she said, gesturing toward the chair across from her, "I am told you have concerns about our labor debt program." "I have more than concerns," I said, sitting down and placing the data chip on her desk. "I have evidence that this program is structured to keep refugee families in permanent debt, regardless of how hard they work. I have a family whose settlement was destroyed by a human convoy during the final months of the war, families who were promised protection and instead received a contract designed to profit from their desperation." Priya's expression remained carefully controlled, though something flickered briefly at the mention of the destroyed settlement. She picked up the data chip and inserted it into a small reader on her desk, scrolling silently through the records for several long minutes while I waited, forcing myself to stay calm despite every instinct urging me to push harder. "These interest calculations are within the parameters our corporate partners established," she said finally, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I did not personally design this system, Sergeant." "Nobody personally designs a system like this," I said. "That is exactly the problem. Everyone points to someone else, and meanwhile a child goes hungry, because the adults responsible for fixing this keep insisting it is not their department." She set the data chip down slowly, studying me with an expression I could not quite read. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I am asking you to review this family's contract personally, and every contract like it in this program, and determine whether the terms are legally defensible under wartime reparations statutes. I served in that war, Director. I know for a fact that Congress passed protective legislation specifically designed to prevent situations like this. Statutes meant to ensure families displaced by human military error receive priority debt relief. That legislation still exists. It has simply been ignored because enforcing it would cost your corporate partners money they would rather not spend. For the first time since I entered her office, Priya's composed expression cracked slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like genuine surprise. You are referring to the Veterans Protection and Displacement Act. I am, I said. Section 14 specifically. I read it more than once during the war, back when soldiers were briefed on exactly what protections we were promising the civilians we displaced or endangered during operations. It has never been repealed. It has simply never been enforced, because nobody with the authority to enforce it has bothered to check whether it applies. Priya was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tapping slowly against the desk. If what you are saying is accurate, this could affect dozens of existing contracts across the station, not just one family. Good, I said. It should. She studied me for several more seconds before finally nodding, slow and deliberate. I will need verification of the statute's current legal standing, and I will need to review every affected contract individually. This is not something I can resolve today, Sergeant Hargrove. But if you are correct about this legislation, I have both the authority and the obligation to act on it. It was not the immediate resolution I had hoped for, but it was more progress than I had expected walking in. I thanked her, left my contact information, and returned to my quarters that evening feeling cautiously hopeful for the first time since this entire situation began. That hope did not last long. 3 days later, Owen contacted me through an encrypted channel, his message short and urgent. Corporate labor representatives had been notified about my inquiry, and they were pushing back hard, threatening legal action against station administration if the debt program came under review. Word had spread through certain circles that a retired sergeant was stirring up trouble that threatened profitable contracts, and not everyone appreciated the disruption. I was not surprised. Systems built on exploitation rarely surrender without a fight, and I had spent enough years in combat to recognize resistance when I felt it forming. What did surprise me was what happened next. 2 days after Owen's warning, I received a message from a name I had not seen in 6 years. Grace Whitmore, former communications officer under my command, now working in station public relations. She had heard through informal channels that I was pushing back against the labor debt program, and she wanted to help. I still remember what you used to say, her message read, that a soldier's duty does not end when the fighting stops, it just changes shape. I think it is time some of us remembered that too. Grace was not alone. Over the following week, word continued to spread through informal veteran networks scattered across Kessler Ring, former soldiers who had settled into civilian careers after the war, but had never quite lost the instinct to protect people who could not protect themselves. One by one, they began reaching out, offering whatever help they could provide. A former logistics officer named Nora Bennett helped compile a full audit of every Verrill family currently trapped in the labor debt program, cross-referencing their contracts against wartime displacement records to identify exactly how many families qualified for protection under the statute I had cited. A former legal officer named Lucas Grant, who had transitioned into station administration after the war, offered to draft the formal legal argument needed to force corporate labor representatives to acknowledge the statute's applicability, working late into the night sessions that stretched across nearly a full week. Even Ethan Cole, the labor oversight clerk who had initially seemed so resigned to bureaucratic inertia, began quietly providing internal documentation that supported our case, risking his own position in the process because, as he told me privately one evening, he had joined civil service hoping to help people and had lost sight of that somewhere along the way. It was not a fast process. Corporate representatives fought every step, filing procedural objections, requesting delays, attempting to reframe the entire situation as a matter of contractual obligation rather than wartime reparations. There were nights I went to bed, convinced the whole effort would collapse under the sheer weight of bureaucratic resistance. But every time I felt that doubt creeping in, I thought about Vesa, about the careful way she folded that drawing back into her lunchbox each day, about the quiet dignity with which she had carried a promise made to her mother years before I ever met her. I thought about every soldier who had ever made a promise like that in the chaos of war, trusting that the people they left behind would someday make good on it, even if they themselves never got the chance to see it through. I was not going to let that promise break on my watch, not after finally understanding exactly what it had cost to make it in the first place. 3 weeks after my first meeting with Director Kapoor, she called me back into her office. Her expression, when I walked in, was harder to read than before, but there was something in her posture that felt different, more resolved. "The legal review is complete," she said, sliding a datapad across her desk toward me. "The Veterans Protection and Displacement Act does apply to families displaced by confirmed human military error during the war. Effective immediately, all qualifying contracts within this program are being reclassified under reparation status, which voids outstanding debt balances entirely and provides retroactive compensation for labor already performed under the previous terms." I stared at the datapad for a long moment, hardly able to believe the words displayed on its surface. "Every family?" I asked. "Not just Vessa's." "Every qualifying family," Priya confirmed. Nora Bennett's audit identified 43 households across 3 different refugee species, affected by similar circumstances. All of them qualify. 43 households, 43 families, who had spent years trapped in a system built to profit from a promise that was never supposed to be broken in the first place. I sat there in silence for a long moment, the weight of it settling over me slowly, not as triumph exactly, but as something quieter and heavier. Relief, mixed with a grief I had not expected. Grief for every day those families had spent believing nobody would ever come to fix what had been done to them. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice rougher than I intended. Priya nodded once, something almost like respect crossing her carefully controlled expression. "Thank the statute, Sergeant, and thank whoever wrote it, all those years ago, with enough foresight to know a promise like that might someday need enforcing." I left her office that afternoon carrying the datapad carefully in both hands, the same way Vessa had once handed me her folded drawing, like something fragile and important that deserved to be protected all the way to its destination. I knew exactly where I needed to go next. I made my way down to lower deck 3 faster than I probably should have, my legs carrying me through the narrow corridors of Sector 12, with an urgency I had not felt since my last combat deployment. This time the urgency was not fear. It was something closer to joy, though it had been so long since I felt that particular emotion that it took me a moment to recognize it properly. Vessa's family unit door opened before I even reached it, Amira standing in the frame with an expression somewhere between hope and dread, the look of someone who had learned not to expect good news, but could not quite stop herself from wanting it anyway. "Sergeant Hargrove," she said carefully, "you look like a man carrying something important." "I am," I said, holding up the datapad. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, and I found Vessa sitting at the small table, her lunchbox open in front of her, though this time she was not pretending to eat from it. She was simply holding it, turning it slowly in her hands, the same way a person holds an object that carries more memory than weight. "Vessa," I said, kneeling down beside her chair so we were at eye level, "I need to tell you and your mother something very important, and I need you to listen carefully, because it changes everything." Amira sat down across from us, her hands folding together tightly in her lap. I explained everything, slowly and clearly: the statute, the review, the reclassification, the voided debt, the compensation for years of labor performed under terms that should never have applied to them in the first place. I watched Amira's face shift through disbelief, then confusion, then something that broke open entirely, as the full weight of what I was telling her finally settled in. "The debt is gone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Completely." "Completely," I confirmed. "As of today, your family, along with 42 other households on this station, are no longer bound by those contracts. You are free to work wherever you choose, live wherever your resources allow, and the compensation for years of underpaid labor will be processed within the next billing cycle." Amira pressed both hands over her mouth, her shoulders shaking silently for a long moment before she finally managed to speak again. "I do not know how to thank you for this," she said. "I do not think there are words large enough." "You do not need to thank me," I said. A promise was made to your family 6 years ago, in the middle of chaos, by a soldier who believed in it enough to say it out loud, even while your settlement was falling apart around you. I am simply the person who happened to be in a position to finally keep it. That debt belonged to humanity as a whole, not to me personally. Vesa had been quiet through this entire exchange, still holding her lunchbox carefully in both hands, her amber eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me wonder exactly what was moving through her young mind. Finally she spoke. "Does this mean I do not have to pretend anymore?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Something in my chest tightened painfully at the simple honesty of that question, a question no child should ever need to ask, but one that carried an answer I finally got to give her with complete certainty. "No," I said, "you never have to pretend again." She looked down at her lunchbox one more time, then slowly reached inside and pulled out the folded drawing, the one that had traveled with her through every hungry day since her family arrived on this station. She unfolded it carefully and studied it for a long moment before looking back up at me. "I want to add something," she said. "Can I?" "Of course," I said, not entirely sure what she meant. She reached into a small drawer nearby and pulled out a set of colored pencils, worn down to stubs from years of careful use. She smoothed the drawing flat against the table and, with slow, deliberate strokes, added a second armored figure beside the first, standing shoulder to shoulder with the soldier her mother had described to her years ago. Beneath the two figures, she wrote a single new word in careful galactic standard lettering: kept. I stared at that word for a long time, feeling something break loose inside my chest that I had kept locked away since long before I ever met her, something that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with what came after it, the slow, quiet grief of wondering whether any of the promises made during those chaotic years had ever actually mattered to anyone once the fighting stopped. I felt my eyes burn, and for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I did not try to stop the tears that followed. I sat there at that small table, in a cramped residential unit on lower deck 3, crying quietly, in front of an 8-year-old girl and her mother, and neither of them seemed to think it was strange at all. Amira simply reached over and placed her hand gently on my shoulder, a small gesture of shared understanding between two people who had both carried more weight than anyone should have to carry alone. "Thank you," Vesa said softly, sliding the drawing across the table toward me. "For being kept." I did not fully understand what she meant at first, not until I read it again, more carefully. She was not thanking me for keeping a promise. She was thanking me for being the proof that a promise, once made, did not have to disappear just because time passed and people forgot. She was thanking me for being living evidence that her mother had not been foolish to believe a stranger's words in the middle of a burning settlement all those years ago. I folded the drawing carefully and handed it back to her, though this time she shook her head. "Keep it," she said. "I do not need to carry it in my lunchbox anymore. I know it is true now. I do not need to hold on to the paper to remember." I took the drawing gently, understanding the full weight of what she was giving me. Not just a piece of paper, but permission to finally set down a burden I had been carrying since long before I ever saw her sitting alone by that cafeteria window. Over the following weeks, I watched Vesa's life change in small but meaningful ways. Her parents transferred out of the recycling facility into positions better suited to their actual skills, work they had been forced to abandon years earlier, simply to keep up with an impossible debt. Amira, it turned out, had trained as an engineer before the war destroyed her settlement, and within a month, she secured a position in the station's environmental systems division, work that finally matched her actual capabilities. Vesa herself began showing up to school activities with a confidence I had never seen in her before, no longer hiding her intelligence out of fear that being noticed carried risk. She won a station-wide navigation competition 3 months later, the same skill I had once watched her quietly suppress in front of other children. And this time, she did not step back and let someone else claim the credit. I made a point of eating lunch with her at least twice a week after that, sitting across from her instead of 2 tables away, watching her open a lunchbox that was never empty again. Sometimes her parents joined us. Sometimes other Veril families whose debts had also been voided through the same statute, sat nearby, slowly forming a small community that no longer had to hide its hunger or its history. The story of what happened spread further than I expected. Other veterans across Kessler Ring began quietly reviewing old wartime promises they had made during their service, checking whether similar statutes applied to other displaced families they had once sworn to protect. Grace Whitmore helped organize a small, informal network dedicated to exactly this kind of work, veterans holding their own promises accountable, long after the uniforms came off, long after the war itself had faded into history most people preferred not to think about too carefully. I never did find out for certain whether the soldier in Vessa's drawing had served directly under my command. I searched through old unit records for weeks, cross-referencing timelines and locations, but the chaos of that final retreat had left too many gaps, too many incomplete reports filed by soldiers who never made it home to finish them properly. Eventually, I stopped searching. It did not matter anymore whose voice Amira remembered from that burning night. What mattered was that the promise itself had finally been honored, regardless of which specific soldier first spoke it into the darkness. Humanity as a whole had made that promise, and humanity, however slowly, however imperfectly, had finally found a way to keep it. 6 months after that first day I saw her pretending to eat, I sat with Vessa in the cafeteria during an ordinary lunch period. Nothing special about the day itself, just an average afternoon on a station, slowly learning to live up to its own better instincts. She was telling me, with the kind of animated enthusiasm only children seem capable of, about a science project she was building for her class, something involving the station's water recycling systems that sounded far more sophisticated than anything I remembered doing at her age. I watched her talk, watched her laugh freely at her own small joke about a malfunctioning filter, watched her open her lunchbox without hesitation or performance, simply because she was hungry, and there was food inside, and there was no longer any reason to pretend otherwise. I thought about the empty lunchbox I first saw all those months ago, about the careful, practiced way she had chewed on nothing, about the drawing she had carried folded and refolded until the creases went soft as fabric. I thought about every soldier who ever made a promise in the middle of chaos, trusting someone else, someday, somewhere, would find a way to keep it, even after they themselves were gone from the story. I did not become a soldier again that day in the cafeteria, watching her eat a real meal for the first time. I did not need to. I had already discovered something far more important than any battlefield victory I ever earned in uniform, something I carried with me long after the war officially ended, and long after most people assumed old soldiers like me had nothing left to give. Some promises do not expire when the fighting stops. Some of them simply wait, patiently, quietly, folded inside an empty lunchbox, for someone willing to finally notice, and finally, after all this time, keep them.